All right, thank you, everybody. I know that we started a little bit late, so we wanted to make sure that we could get everybody who was leaving the keynote sessions. I'm Jen Gray, and I'm with Amazon Web Services North America Public Sector Security Assurance and Compliance Program. My team manages all of our federal compliance, including FedRAMP, the DoD, Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide, state local education compliance requirements such as CGIS, FERPA, and 508 compliance, ITAR. So we work with our public sectors and enabling them to accelerate secure cloud connections and cloud adoption across the government and the US regions and Canada. I'm very excited today. Last year, we had FedRAMP Accelerated. We had Matt Goodrich, the FedRAMP director, talk about this new authorization process to help shorten the process time frame that many of our SaaS partners are going through today so that they can enable cloud adoption across the government. We have a fantastic group today to talk about the evolution of FedRAMP Accelerated. We have our GovCloud team, our Cloud.gov team from GSA, and our FedRAMP PMO team. They're going to talk about their story, best practices on how they went through the FedRAMP Accelerated, and you get to learn more about Cloud.gov, what it means to agencies today and how you can leverage it as well. So without further ado, I'm going to have each of our fantastic participants and guest speakers introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Shashank.
Hello, everybody. My name is Shashank. I'm Director of Cloud.gov. My mission is to help federal agencies adopt the cloud. And as Director of Cloud.gov, the favorite thing I do is talk to new and prospective customers and work with them on seeing if Cloud.gov is the right fit.
I'm Britta Gustafson. I am Deputy Director of Cloud.gov. So I work with Shashank in the General Services Administration in 18F, where Cloud.gov is built and operated. And I work with Shashank on our business development. And I also work with our team on making sure what we're hearing from customers is aligned with what the team is working on and helping them do that. And I also do a lot of our work with compliance as a team, both managing and maintaining our own compliance and also answering our customer questions about compliance.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Claudio Bololi. I'm the program manager at FedRAMP, and my day-to-day job is overseeing the cloud service providers that go through working with our Joint Authorization Board for provisional ATOs. And then once they get these ATOs, I also manage our continuous monitoring program for those CSPs. So I have my favorite thing is working with cloud service providers and getting them through to ATOs. And I also work with our other stakeholder partners, the third-party assessment organizations and the JAB review teams that review all the packages. So I bring all those three groups together and get these ATOs through and signed by the CIOs.
And good morning, I'm Ashley Mahan. I'm the FedRAMP Agency Evangelist. My role is I work with agencies understanding their cloud needs, their strategic initiatives in moving to the cloud, and empowering them to work with cloud service providers in the FedRAMP way and issuing FedRAMP authorizations. And also I work with cloud service providers, bridging the gap between them and their agency partners and helping them through the agency authorization process.
Thank you. So we're going to dive right into this. So Shashank and Britta, could you share with the audience about, what is Cloud.gov? What is the mission? How does it help agencies? We'd like to learn more about your solution and what you guys had to do to get through this process.
Yep, absolutely. So that's us. So Cloud.gov's mission is to help enable federal government teams to quickly host and update modern web applications, and especially do that without having to duplicate common infrastructure and security compliance work, right? Because there's lots of federal government agencies and there's lots of applications, and you can imagine that if each did their own thing, that's a lot of duplicated work there. And how we do this, Cloud.gov is a shared service offered by the General Services Administration. And it's a platform as a service offering. And we use the open source Cloud Foundry under the hood. And Cloud.gov is based on Amazon Web Services GovCloud. And my team is responsible for maintaining and developing and managing the infrastructure and the platform piece of that. And we do that in a compliant way, which Britta is going to tell you more about.
All right. So as part of GSA, as part of 18F, part of what our division does is it works with a lot of different agency partners to help them develop custom solutions for their agency needs. And one thing that our teams kept learning over and over is that federal information system compliance requirements are very lengthy and very complicated, as I'm sure all of you are very, very familiar with. Everything from paperwork management, Paperwork Reduction Act, to Federal Information System security compliance. And we kept seeing that the security compliance part of it was taking teams months to be able to actually move their projects to production through a very lengthy authority to operate process. And we were like, well, this doesn't have to be this way. Like, what if we build in some of that security compliance into a platform, not just at the infrastructure level, but at a higher level of application environment abstraction? And we were talking to some of our agency partners about it. We were talking to our own agency about it. And we heard from every single person, like, that sounds great. We'd love to use that, but we really can't just use it. If all you say is, well, it works for GSA, our compliance folks gave us an ATO. You really need FedRAMP. And we were like, okay, FedRAMP is the gold standard. We got to do this. So from the beginning of building Cloud.gov and adapting it from the open source projects that we were using, we're like, all right, we got to build it for FedRAMP. So that's exactly what we did. We started adapting this Cloud Foundry open source project for specifically government needs, and specifically the most common web application needs in government, and also related kinds of applications, such as the API that goes along with your web application. And we were testing this internally with teams building these products. And once we got it into a pretty stable, sort of feature-complete state, we began working with the FedRAMP process. And so, as many of you know, one of the first steps there is engaging your third-party assessment organization, your 3PAO, your auditor. And so we worked with this auditor to establish our FedRAMP Ready status as part of the relatively new FedRAMP Accelerated program. So we made sure that before we entered into the full FedRAMP process, we knew that we were on the right path. So then, as part of FedRAMP Accelerated, we worked more with our auditor and more on our documentation, preparing that full package with extensive detail about our security compliance. And we began our review with the JAB teams in about August 2016. So this created a series of discussions, documentation review, a lot of comments back and forth, trying to help them understand the system. And as part of that, we found a few more additional things we needed to work on internally, such as improving our logging and continuing to improve our documentation, especially to explain a few parts of our system that the Joint Authorization Board was not yet as familiar with. So that took about 8 weeks for just our additional work internally, and about 23 weeks only of that sort of back and forth discussion of our documentation and processes, operations, team policies. There's a lot of things to review. We got through it. So in January 2017, we received our FedRAMP P-ATO with signatures from CIOs of Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, General Services Administration. And turned out by that time it was about the end of January, so we announced it in February. And one of the things that I didn't know when I was going through this process is that FedRAMP PMO, especially Claudio, will then arrange to talk to the Department of Defense DISA team and arrange the sort of equivalent provisional authorization letter for DoD folks. So for our system, that's a moderate system, the equivalent is DISA impact level 2. So that took a little more time to get that all signed up.
So Britta, when you went through this FedRAMP Accelerated process, what would be the top 3 best practices that you could share with the audience and the agencies of what they can learn through the FedRAMP Accelerated process?
It's really hard to boil it down to just 3 because this was part of my life for about 6 months. It's a lot of work. It turned out to be completely fascinating, and I can seriously talk about it all day if any of you all want to talk about it. But I tried to boil this down into a few different areas. One was, it was critical to have a really technically strong product. So in our case, this meant really strict infrastructure as code practices, where all of our configuration for our underlying infrastructure is captured as configuration files. And these configuration files are very strictly version controlled. And our version control system, requires 2 of our team members from a very specific team to, one makes the pull request and one merges the pull request, right? This is a relatively ordinary practice, but we framed it as strict configuration management, because that's what it really is. We also have a very strict practice of continuous deployment. We never have human hands messing around in production. All of our changes go through configuration management, continuous deployment. That really helped with a surprisingly huge number of controls. And on the documentation side, which is really the side that I was working on as a technical writer, we learned through experience that it was critical to have your technical writer, your content designer, as we call it at 18F, embedded within your technical team. I know my technical team. They're my teammates. I know that their children are adorable and that they're wonderful people. And so we worked both one-on-one together, where the platform engineer who had implemented this platform and I talked it through, looked at the requirement, asked one of our teammates who was really good at sort of understanding compliance language for more advice on interpreting the control, and we wrote it together. We also had our engineers pair together on writing the documentation, and this is a very common practice in mature engineering teams to do pair programming, but we learned that pair documentation writing is also critical, because you got to talk it through when you're trying to explain something. And really, the P-ATO documentation is fundamentally about explaining your system, in our case, to the Joint Authorization Board. We learned also through experience, through a series of mistakes, that it was critical to keep our diagrams as code in version control as well, because the documentation package requires very detailed and complex diagrams that the Joint Authorization Board reviewers use as almost like a glossary as they evaluate the system. So we used a simple open source markup language and maintained our diagrams in that markup language, which then automatically generate our diagrams. So you're never asking who's got the latest file? It's right there. And for example, I'm a technical writer. I understand how to explain things. I don't always understand the platform details precisely. I could make a pull request, make a proposal for how to clarify the diagram, and one of our engineers could review my change and merge it after they verified that it was technically correct as well. We also ended up needing to keep our team policies and procedures in our version control so that our engineers were familiar with also how to make changes. This makes sure that our policies and procedures are in line with our actual practices, because everyone on our team knows how to propose a change and get that change reviewed. And that, we can always roll it back. We can work on different branches. So much easier than maintaining a series of Word docs. So much easier. Can't explain how much easier it is. And then on the compliance side, we made sure to leverage as much as we possibly could from underlying systems. So we leveraged the FedRAMP P-ATO of Amazon GovCloud, which took care of a number of controls for us, especially on the hardware side. And we also inherited many policies and procedures from our agency. General Services Administration already has a very sophisticated set of personnel security policies and procedures that are already in place. So what we really had to do there was talk to the folks who maintain those policies and procedures and just write summaries and references to the right documents, instead of reduplicating the work that was already done in our larger agency. So the result of that was our P-ATO, and as an example of what we came up with, if you have a moderate system, a pretty typical straightforward application on cloud.gov, you will inherit a huge number of controls. So moderate's typically about 325 security controls, depending on your agency. You will inherit about 269. Many of those, let's see, I think it's about 40, 50 of them are us inheriting from GovCloud underneath. There's about 41 shared controls where we do some of the work and you do some of the work. A good example of that are some of the account management controls where, we provide the tools for you to, assign roles in your cloud.gov usage, but you have to make sure that you assign the roles to the right people and remove them at the appropriate times. And there's about 15 controls that are just the customer's responsibility that, cloud.gov has no influence on. And this really depends on your system. Compliance is always a conversation between you and whoever's authorizing your system. So, depending on your system, you may have more of these controls that turn out to be shared controls, but this is an example.
So Britta, you bring up a really good point here about controls. So going back to, the 3 best practices, one is that you all at 18F and Cloud.gov have really instituted automation, developing code to do a lot of the version control, which is really important. Automation is key.
Yes.
The other thing that you pointed out was having the right team, making sure that you guys were working together, understanding the engineering, making sure that the compliance team was there with you as well, and being able to extrapolate all that information so that the JAB who was reviewing this would be able to understand this is how you're protecting the system, this is how you're implementing the controls, et cetera. What we get a lot of questions on from our customers is inheritance. How do we inherit AWS's control when we go through this FedRAMP Accelerated process? Can you kind of shed some color on that for us?
Oh yeah, and this is also a kind of question that I receive from our customers on how do I figure out what to inherit from cloud.gov. So the critical thing is, of course, reading the P-ATO materials. They're lengthy and detailed and very precise for a reason because they're meant to help you as a customer. So we reviewed those, we read it, we understood it. That also really helped us because it's hard to know what to write if you don't have any model. So the AWS SSP also helped us understand a little bit more about how to write an SSP. But ultimately, the point was us trying to understand what AWS was communicating and then working with our authorizing folks, which were the Joint Authorization Board representatives, to really look at our system and talk about it and figure out what, in practice, if we looked at the controls, did we inherit it? And that ends up being a conversation. Because even if, for example, something is marked, fully handled by AWS, if our system is doing something complex or, in addition to that requirement that's specific to our system, we're still going to have to document that and explain it. Or also, a simple example is, we inherit also controls from our agency, but it turned out, for example, that, we do so much open source work as cloud.gov. Our code is open source, a lot of our documentation is open source, a lot of our policies are open source. And so the Joint Authorization Board looked at that, and our auditor looked at that specifically, and said, well, you're doing so much of this, you're doing more than GSA usually does. Even though you're saying that you're inheriting this policy from GSA on, making sure your team is properly trained to not disclose information you're not supposed to disclose, we'd really like to see more internal training. We'd like to see your team, manage some of that training yourselves. And so we did. We developed that training. We do that training. We have a procedure for that training. We have, a checklist to make sure that we've all done it. So it's about that conversation with your authorizing team to really help them understand your system. It's not, the checklist is just there as a guide for the conversation. So, yeah. Let's see. I'll pass it off to Shashank to talk a little bit more about our mission.
Yeah, so I think that shared compliance and infrastructure work that cloud.gov really allows agencies to focus on their mission, right? So my favorite government website is the screenshot on the left there. It's everykidinapark.gov. How many of you have fourth graders? A few fourth graders. Well, Every Kid in a Park is about letting fourth graders and their families go to national parks for free. And so this is something I worked on a couple years ago, and there's 2 of us developers working on this. I was the back-end developer, and we had a front-end developer, and we had some design and UX folks. But we were only given 3 months to develop and push this website to production, at the end of which the president was going to make an announcement. And it turns out that that's a deadline you can't miss. You kind of have to make that. So what we did was, and even though cloud.gov, I think in those days was in its early stages, we deployed it on cloud.gov because not having to deal with that infrastructure and with the security configuration and the compliance work made my life a lot easier and made us able to meet our deadline, and we did, so that was exciting. The second example there is called Call It Scorecard. It's about, it's for seniors that are looking at colleges across the United States. That one's from the Department of Education, and that one was developed by a small 18F and United States Digital Services team, and then now is managed and maintained by a contractor. Oh, yep. Oh no, too fast. And so one of the things that cloud.gov is really, really passionate about is making sure that we build the right product, especially for vendors. And we're super excited about supporting the vendor community, right? And I think we help do that in 3 ways. The first way is allowing vendor teams to use cloud.gov in the work that they do with agencies. And then because they benefit from that lower technical and compliance burdens, they can deliver code faster to the agencies, right? And I think this benefits the vendors and it benefits agencies as well. The second way is sort of building products that run on cloud.gov. And because cloud.gov uses that common Cloud Foundry model, when a product is in development, it can deploy on Cloud Foundry, and then that can easily run on cloud.gov by agency. So if a vendor has a product that they want to sell to multiple agencies, they can say, hey, this already runs on cloud.gov, right? And that makes that a little bit easier. And plus cloud.gov is this nice modern infrastructure that apps can run on. And all of this sort of also translates to allowing small businesses and making it easier for small business to work with the government because there's the reduced burdens and because the infrastructure stuff is taken care of, you can deploy smaller teams with the agency.
So Shashank, I want to ask you about that, especially with cloud.gov, and how you had to help accelerate, especially a lot of the projects that you had moving forward. Can you kind of talk about like the impact that it has had on some of these customers that you've worked with, and also how it transformed the way that they deliver services today?
Sure. That's a great question because you can see our list of current customers here. And let's talk about the Federal Election Commission. So the Federal Election Commission hired 18F to redo their website. And that website was, during development, was on cloud.gov, and then later is now in production on cloud.gov. So FEC.gov is on cloud.gov, which is a big deal. And one of the things that the organization there did is they calculated how much it would save them to run on cloud.gov, and that works out by their calculations to be about $1.2 million annually is how much they're going to save versus running the website in their data center. And a lot of this is because when you're in the cloud, everyone here knows this, right? You don't have to buy that excess server capacity up front like you do in a data center. You just buy as much as you need to use at that time, and that's a little bit of where their savings are coming from. And I encourage you all to go to the FEC.gov website. It's beautiful. There's lots of great data on campaign finance information. And the other example I want to talk about is the FDIC. And they're also running their main agency website on cloud.gov. And they didn't hire 18F to do that. They just sort of did that on their own. They used our documentation. I think they had a few conversations with our support team. But they were able to do that pretty quickly, and they, at least so far, seem to be pretty happy with Cloud.gov.
Very good. So now we're going to be transitioning over to our FedRAMP PMO team. Now that FedRAMP Accelerated is live, we have a lot of SaaS partners who are going through this process as well. We're very excited that Cloud.gov has taken off and is doing amazing things with agencies today. So we'd like to know what is coming up in FedRAMP's in the FedRAMP PMO today, and what are some things that we can tell the audience of where you are strategically moving, how we're going to help modernize, continue to modernize the government's enterprise IT services to provide better services for the public sector.
Sure. So I'll take that then, and I'll pass it to Ashley too for her side of it. So what we did with FedRAMP Accelerated, as Britta was saying, is we got these cloud service providers through in a really reduced amount of time, right? In 3 to 4 months for the ones that we tested the process with. And it worked, and we were happy that it worked, so then we decided that we rolled it out, and that is now the JAB authorization process, our Joint Authorization Board process. So that's what we use for every new CSP that's coming through for that Joint Authorization Board, ATO. And then to kind of back it up a little bit, we also changed the way the JAB is selecting the CSPs that they're going to work with for an ATO. So we had an event, it's called FedRAMP Connect, and there was a lot of lead-in work to that, but ultimately the goal coming through that is that the JAB would work with CSPs that have government demand, right? So that we're working with the right CSPs, because there's a limited amount of resources even on the PMO side and on the JAB side for those JAB review teams especially. And so we can get to about 12 CSPs in a year working through the JAB. So we wanted to make sure we're picking the right 12 and it's the right product that's in demand by government departments and agencies. So that's a big part of the selection criteria going forward. And then working with the JAB, going through in that new process, we also changed the way that resources are dedicated so that there's dedicated JAB review teams that work with the CSP like they did with Cloud.gov to help them get through and answer those questions and move the process a lot faster. So on the kind of new initiative side, so kind of in tandem with what we did with FedRAMP Accelerated, we always knew that once we fixed the authorization process, we needed to also take a look at the way we're doing continuous monitoring. And so I've engaged, started in that effort too, talking to all the cloud service providers that have the JAB P-ATO to see the level of effort that they put in to do continuous monitoring over on their side. Knowing how many resources we put into it on the PMO side and the JAB as well, it's a tremendous amount of resources, so we want to make sure we're doing that more efficiently too. So we've embarked on that effort with talking to all the CSPs. I've actually finished kind of that phase of it. I'm starting now talking to agency customers to see what they want and need from continuous monitoring for cloud service providers they use. And then kind of the third part of it, because we have those 3 stakeholders and everything, will be our 3 PAOs and talking to them too, because often they assist those cloud service providers, some on a monthly basis, but at least, but at a minimum, they have to do their annual assessment, so that is where they come in and check that the CSP is doing their monthly continuous monitoring appropriately. So that's the big initiatives that I've been working on the JAB side.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's not going to be called FedRAMP Accelerated anymore. This is now the new JAB process.
Exactly, yeah. That's what we called it when we were testing it, so now it is the JAB process.
And I think just a point to add is one of the things that is trending across FedRAMP right now is this new initiative we put out called FedRAMP Ready. So it's based on a readiness assessment, and the way that we worked previously with the Joint Authorization Board is more of a first in, first out method. So if you're a cloud service provider and you wanted to work with the JAB, we would work with you, but we had this long queue. And we would work with you whether you had a notional system, it didn't exist, whether you were familiar with the federal requirements and FISMA, right? Basically just hop on in line, and when your number was called, then we'd start working with you. And we realized, that wasn't very efficient, right? We needed to start managing expectations. We wanted to ensure cloud service providers, when they said that they wanted to work with us, or when the JAB dedicated their resources to start working with cloud service providers, that they were ready from the get-go. They were familiar with FedRAMP, they were familiar with the federal requirements. Their system was indeed built from a technical standpoint to meet these requirements. And for instance, multi-factor authentication how we used to work is that it was very much documentation focused. And so as we were reading the couple 100-page SSP, we'd get to the IA control family, and that was the first time that we would see, oh, how do you do multi-factor, right? And then we say, you're not, you're doing more of a two-step, not a true two-factor, right? And then the CSP would have to go off on the back end, right, and reconfigure things and change a bunch of things, which would really extend those timelines. So this readiness assessment is done by 3 P-ATO, and it is I like to say it's a quick check. It's a pulse check where they come in, they look at your technical, your architecture, they look at your policies and procedures or things that already exist, they look at your organizational maturity, things that we designated right from the get-go that were showstoppers that really prolonged this authorization process. And from an agency standpoint, I see a lot of agencies that love working, or they're like, who's FedRAMP ready, Ashley? Because it gives them kind of the assurance that this cloud service provider has done their homework and that they're ready to do the authorization. And so that's one of the things, is that we review that readiness assessment, and once a CSP obtains a FedRAMP or is designated as FedRAMP ready, that's us, the FedRAMP PMO, standing behind, basically backing that CSP, saying, you know what, we have a high degree of assurance that they can make it through an agency authorization or with the JAB in under 6 months. So that's just a little bit about FedRAMP Ready. And then from the accelerated process, the way that we're working with the JAB, I've had a lot of agencies approach me saying, hey, Ashley, I want to do the same thing. I want to speed up the agency authorization timelines at my agency. How do I do this? So I'm hitting the road. I've been talking to a lot of agencies about it, training them on what we've done, best practices and lessons learned, and really hope to speed up the authorization timeline government-wide with individual agencies.
So you talked about FedRAMP Ready. So we've actually leveraged the same FedRAMP Ready for AWS's services and scope for FedRAMP as well. We work very closely with our third-party assessor to give our customers that trust center, letting them know that this has gone through the rigor just like we would put through any other services through FedRAMP. So it goes through our third-party assessor, and it's ready for agencies to leverage and use, and that's available on our public website as well. So actually, now that we've got the new JAB process is now the FedRAMP Accelerated process, that's really shortening the authorization process. We've heard a lot, especially with the recent cybersecurity risk framework that NIST produced out there, focusing on security outcomes instead of looking at security controls. How is FedRAMP moving towards that, or how is FedRAMP aligning towards that?
Yeah, I think just from FedRAMP Ready and kind of really from a FedRAMP standpoint, we're focusing on risk. We're focusing on the technical security. We are, the documentation is important. It needs to be there, but in my humble opinion, it's what a lot of folks struggle with, and it takes the longest time to get right? One of the things that we kind of giggle about on the program, especially with Matt, you probably have heard him say, if you have a great technical writer, if you're a cloud service provider and you have a great technical writer, give them a raise, right? To make them very happy, because they're very rare to come by, right? So some of you in the audience might be technical writers, make sure we set it up here, you guys, you get the gold star for the day. So, just as a program, we are always willing to iterate, align to the newest and latest directives that are coming out and initiatives, and really where our customers want us to go is where we're going to go. So, with the new cybersecurity framework, it's something that, we completely align to, and as a program, we're focusing on risk, documentation is important, but really when it comes down to it, it's risk and the technical, and your risk, I said risk 5 times, but your risk posture, yeah.
Very good. So what is this about this FedRAMP Connect? Can you kind of tell us more about FedRAMP Connect? We hear that a lot, and I think the audience would like to know, how do they, is this connecting to FedRAMP? What is this about?
So FedRAMP Connect, so the first one was held back at the end of February, earlier this year. But there was a lot of lead-in work too, and so CSPs that were interested in pursuing the JAB provisional authorization had to submit a business case to the PMO. They went into the PMO review, and the JAB reviewed that as well. And then out of that, there were a set of candidates that were selected to then go and present at this event. And so it was kind of set up in a Shark Tank style, if you want to call it that, right? So there was a group, a board that the CSPs presented to, and there were representatives from the Federal CIO Council, were there, OMB, and our FedRAMP Joint Authorization Board. And each CSP then came in, described their service, and in particular the security that they have around their service, and talked about the benefits of their service and some of the agency demand that they see, they have or that they see across the government. And then from that, all of those providers there was a scoring methodology, and all those providers were scored. And then ultimately the Joint Authorization Board decided which of those CSPs they wanted to select. And so there were 7 that came out of this February event. We've kicked off with 2 of them already a couple months ago now, or less than 2 months ago now. We're about to kick off with the 3rd one tomorrow, actually. And then the other 3 or 4 are scheduled throughout the rest of this year. There'll be a couple more kicking off in the fall, and then 1 or 2 in the summer as well. So.
How do we get information about that?
About FedRAMP Connect? So what we decided to do, that was the first event we had. There's going to be a second event, and we're looking to do them every 6 months or so is the cadence. And we'll be releasing more information. I'm not sure what the timeline is yet, but I know it's coming out soon.
It's coming out. So we're going to be updating our business case. So the thing, if you want to work with the JAB, there's a business case form that you need to fill out. That's going to be a web form that we'll be releasing on our website, hopefully within the next month. And then you would complete that, and that kind of gives us the high sign that you're interested in working with the JAB. And then our teams are ready to work with you and coach you through the process. And hopefully get you in front of the JAB and other CIOs across the government to make your pitch on why you should work with them. Mm-hmm.
So where is FedRAMP today? We'd like to know, where are you guys at, and is it, are things improving? Are things getting better? Are we accelerating cloud adoption across the public sector?
Yeah. No, so great. So I think the one thing that I want to just announce, or at least draw attention to, which I thought I would have on the slide, but I don't, is that we just released our brand new logo. So you'll see a big F and an R in a blue box. That's the new FedRAMP logo that we just rolled out last week. And with that, we turned 5. So we celebrated our 5th year anniversary last week. And then year after year, we have doubled the number of FedRAMP authorized cloud service offerings on the program, and at this time we're at 82, almost 83, from an email I just got this morning. And a little known fact is that over 1/3 of those cloud service providers that are authorized are small business. So the beauty about FedRAMP, and it's kind of like my public service announcement, is that the FedRAMP authorization is the way to go for agencies if you are using any cloud service offering, right? I've worked with a lot of agencies where they have their own internal processes and things like that. Once a cloud service provider, they're making a huge investment to go down this route. They're creating all of the deliverables, the security deliverables. They're performing the testing that FISMA requires them to do in order for an agency to make a risk-based decision. The beauty about FedRAMP is once that is done initially and reviewed by either the JAB or another agency, that's your passport. That allows any other agency out there to review that same series of security deliverables and testing material and issue their subsequent authorizations, right? So there's a huge time savings. Back in the day, before cloud was a thing in the government, it was very different. Each agency would have their unique security policies that a vendor or an environment would have to comply with. And so that passport thing did not exist. So another note for any agencies out there, just know that you're partnering with a cloud service provider through this. The cloud service provider is here to make your life easier in understanding the risk associated with their system. They're the ones that are completing the documentation. They're the ones that are bringing on a 3 P-ATO to do the testing. They're providing these deliverables to you, right? And then agency, you're more in that review mode to ensure that how they comply with 125, 325, or 421 security requirements based on low, moderate, or high impact level protections that you need as an agency, you're more or less reviewing those and understanding your customer responsibilities. So that was my one public service announcement that I gave myself. And so with that reuse model, if is done approximately 471 times, and so which means out of the 82 authorizations that are currently FedRAMP authorized, that they are on average used at least 5 times across the entire US government. And with that said, 108 is kind of off there, but that is not 10 agencies. That is 108 agencies that I proactively work with. There are customers of mine that are either working with cloud service providers for an authorization, or they're using FedRAMP authorized cloud services at this time. And there's 155, I want to say, CSPs in the process, and then 43 3PAOs. And it's really important to note this. 3PAOs play an important role. They, from a government standpoint, are our trusted testing agent. They're the ones that are independent. They go out there, they validate that whatever the cloud service provider says they do in documentation and how they comply. The 3PAO validates that, and they provide those results to us as agencies to make that risk-based decision.
Thank you, Ashley. I've got 2 questions, and then we're going to open it up for the audience.
Great.
So the first question I have is that, what is FedRAMP doing to continue to make FedRAMP the standard for cloud service providers to go through an authorization process, to prevent the outliers, if you will? I mean, we've got multiple, we'll have some agencies will have their own flavor to doing cloud security authorizations, or other departments. Is there a plan to move FedRAMP as being the one for all of the federal government?
Right. So it is the one. It is a requirement. But I'll tell you, I mean, I can't sit up here and say that I haven't worked with agencies that have asked cloud service providers to do different things. I mean, and that absolutely, it's very frustrating for me, because FedRAMP, we have a specific framework. We have a unified framework. It benefits the cloud service provider and the agency. It makes the agency's life easier. It's everything that an agency needs to make that risk-based decision. So one of the things that I do on a daily basis is I meet with agency after agency. So if you're a cloud service provider and you are, coming across this hurdle, please get a hold of me, agency@fedramp.gov, and I'm more than happy to talk to any of your customers to educate them on FedRAMP, to kind of close that awareness gap, because at the end of the day, we're all working together to move to secure cloud in the most efficient way possible.
And the second question that I have is, do customers do they have to use a contractor to get FedRAMP compliant?
No, so if you're a cloud service provider and you have all the in-house expertise to go through this process, you're more than welcome to. What we do see is that there are sometimes that a cloud service provider might not have that in-house expertise, so they need some help. So I know, for instance, our 3PAOs out there, some of them offer a consulting practice as well, where they, that they guide and assist cloud service providers along through the process, or there's other organizations out there that do that the same, but it is not required. It's just something that you're more than welcome to obtain.
Thank you. So we've got about 2.5 minutes for questions. Does anybody in the audience have a question? And we can ask the FedRAMP PMO, or we can ask cloud.gov. Yes?
I have a question for the cloud.gov personnel there.
Okay. We've got a
Hello? Yeah, I have a question for the cloud.gov personnel. Unfortunately, your last slide indicated how to procure cloud.gov. Can you go back to that slide? Because one thing that's our biggest challenge is contracting. We don't need to be sold on AWS. We want to move to AWS. We know we need to get there, but as you know, contracting in the government is the hardest challenge, in my opinion, way harder than migrating. And I think, yeah, it seems to me that you guys have some sort of method to get there more efficiently, more easily. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, we also have little handouts that you can come take that'll have some of this information on there. But it's pretty easy to get cloud.gov. If you're a vendor, you'd have to, so it's federal agencies that can buy cloud.gov, so you'd have to work with your federal agency. And we do this through something called an interagency agreement. Turns out a lot of agencies are familiar with that. It's a pretty standard form. And the interagency agreement process takes about 4 weeks from when we started. And literally is just a bunch of paperwork that goes back and forth and gets signed by different people. And cloud.gov costs somewhere between $10,000 and $100,000 a year per system, and that's based on the type of system and your needs.
Okay, thank you.
looks like
Any
there's
other
one.
questions? We have for like one more question.
On the end.
Oh, back behind you.
Hello. What's the typical cost for a CSP to achieve an ATO?
Great question. So we are currently underway in reevaluating that at this time. Since the efficiencies that we have made through the accelerated program, we have seen that there has been some efficiencies on the back end that a cloud service provider would incur. I will say, just it depends. It depends on the inheritance model. Like for instance, if you're a SaaS and you're inheriting a lot of controls from an infrastructure, right, that makes a big difference. Your knowledge in regarding the requirements and how to do the documentation, I always say that's the long pole in the tent, which can get folks kind of, recreating that wheel and going through things and rewriting things, so that costs start escalating there. So there's a number of factors there, but just know that as a program office, we're currently actually working on putting out a new, some new material on what those updated costs are. So I appreciate that question, and I will say we will get back to you. Yeah.
All right, so this brings us to the end of our session. I'd like to give a nice round of applause for Cloud.gov and the FedRAMP team